same time, spent about 8 months studying it 6 days a week, 7 hours a day. I retired after selling a couple of my software companies, and so I had all the time on my hand. And so, yeah, my interest is also including, of course, the Bible. I go really deep into the Islamic scholarship and especially things to have to do with the jurisprudence, uh, kind of more academic topics. Right. Artie, you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So without further ado, as Artie said, the entire topic is fascinating today. Okay, and it's all about what I want to do is I want to walk through one of the most confusing and I would say one of the most important topics in Quranic studies, uh, ala the Ahruf. So a lot of people have heard the phrase Ahruf, that the Quran was revealed in seven Ahruf, but once you start asking some basic questions, the discussion starts getting very messy very fast. What exactly are the Ahruf? Do all seven still exist today? If not, what happened to them? If they do exist, where are they? These are the things that we're going to work through today. So, my goal here is not to throw some random screenshots at you or overload you with disconnected quotations. I want to give you a clean map of the issue so that by the end of the session, you can actually explain the topic clearly to someone else. And that's going to be our goal. Now, next slide. So, what will this session answer? So, before we get into the hadiths and the reports and the scholarship, just kind of make the roadmap very clear. This session is built around five questions. First, what are the seven aharuf actually supposed to be? Second, are the aharuf and the kirat the same thing, or are those two different categories that later got confused? Third, why did recitation differences create tension even among early Muslims? Fourth, what happened historically to the seven aharuf? Again, were they all preserved? Were some lost? Uh, was only one standardized? And fifth, why does this matter at all? Because if this is only a minor issue of accents, then that is just one kind of discussion we'll have. But if it touches wording, transmission, canonization, preservation claims, then it becomes a much bigger issue. Specifically, folks, this one issue here is, for me, the biggest telltale sign to prove that proves that the Quran is not a divine source. It is a made up source by Muhammad and other men. But we'll go through this, okay? And we'll prove it to you. So, some key terms before we go further. Before we get too far into the argument, I just want to give you some simple working map of the key terms out here, right? First, the harf means a mode or a form here. So lots of things ways where people can describe a harf, which is a singular form. A haruf is the plural form. I am not pretending to solve the whole definition problem. I'm just telling you what category the hadith is talking about when it says the Quran was revealed in the seven aharuf. When the first time it gets introduced to in the Hijaz area, the first time Muhammad introduces it to his followers. Second, the kira'ah means a reading tradition, and kira'at are simply the plural form of it. Third, rasam. Rasam means consonantal skeleton. That's what you call a basic written text before the full later vocalization system people are used to seeing in printed mushafs. Mushaf is a book in the Qurans today. Okay, before that, it was just a skeleton text because those diacritical marks of those dhamma, kasra, the dashes, the circles, all that other stuff, dots, all that stuff, or the full set of vowels comes somewhere 50 to 70 years after Muhammad's death. This is important to know that. So it's after Muhammad's death. And the key line to remember in this is a haruf is earlier, kirat is later. This becomes very important uh, for us to remember, especially when discussing it with Muslims. Okay. moving on, why does this topic matter again? You see, a lot of people hear the topic of a haruf and they assume this is some technical side issue about pronunciations or a recitational style. But quite honestly, that is too shallow of a way to look at it. This is not just a pronunciation question, it is a transmission question because we are asking how the Quran was recited, taught, and passed on. It is also a canonization question because once different forms are in circulation, the different aharufs are in circulation, the question becomes which aharuf or modes were retained, which were standardized, and which were left behind. These are supposed to be the divine words of Allah. So it becomes important to understand that. And ultimately, it becomes a preservation question because Muslims often make a very strong and simple claims that the Quran is the verbatim word of Allah, the precise word of Allah, perfectly preserved with nothing missing. But if the category of the ahruf itself is debated, is unclear, or historically difficult to track, then those preservation claims, i.e., if Allah sent these revelations in seven ahruf, his revelations and the preservation claims become much harder to present as simple or something that is very obvious. All right, moving on. Well,
Jay,
let
if I
me,
can jump in real quick
yeah,
here.
yeah, go ahead.
So, like Jay explained, the reason why we talk about the Ahrufs here is because of the preservation issue. And another part of it is because Muslims today have different versions of the Quran. So, unlike what you may have heard, that they only have one Quran that haven't been changed for 1400 years, that is not true. The reality is Muslims do in fact have 20 versions of the Quran that they actually acknowledge and verify. There are actually more than 20, but the 20 at least are verified and acknowledged. So, and when you ask them, okay, for the ones who actually know about this, very few Muslims know and understand. Well, I wouldn't say understand, but I'll just say they know about the variant Qurans that exist today. And when you ask them, their response almost always is the Ahruf. They always tell you that it's because the Quran was revealed in seven Ahruf. So that's why we're getting into this to explain, okay, does the Ahruf make sense? Do Muslims understand? And that's what Jay is going to go into in detail now and explain to you guys. Their explanation, or what gives a peace of mind to the Muslims today, is because they think, oh, it's been revealed in seven arus. But what does that mean? Do they really understand it? And even if they really had a response for that, does that really take them away from the fact that they have 20 different versions of the Quran? They give us a hard time for having different versions of the Bible, right? They tell us, oh, you have the 66 books, 81, blah, blah, blah. But when they have the same problem, if not worse. So that's why we're getting into the depth of this and into the details. So go ahead, Jay.
Yeah, and here's the key point, guys. I want to keep you a key. Want you to keep in mind throughout the session. Okay, if we cannot define what the aharuf is, this thing that their God gave in seven aharufs, the revelation, the entire Quran, then we cannot tell where it is. Show it to me, point to me, where is it in your Quran? If we ask them, they cannot tell you where it is. If you don't know what it is, you cannot we cannot tell you, they cannot tell us where it is. And if they cannot tell you where it is, then they cannot prove that it was preserved in any clear, demonstrable way. Okay, so they can't prove to us that it was preserved. And that's where this thing all comes together as the most dangerous question to ask these guys. Where we'll play you videos later on where you will see their scholars saying, do not talk about this publicly. Keep it private, and that too only among the upper echelons of their scholarship to be discussed. Do not discuss this issue about Ahruf publicly. So this is not trivial or insignificant matter. This issue sits right in the middle of how the Quran's textual history is understood. Okay, so it's not trivial. Okay, uh, so the starting point, why the Ahruf even enters the discussion. To understand the Ahruf, we have to start at the point where the issue first becomes urgent. Here's something crazy, guys. The Ahruf does not begin at some abstract theological category that the Muslims sat around defining in a classroom. It enters the discussion because early Muslims encountered different recitations of the Quran, and those differences started creating real tension for them. That is the key starting point. So, this is very important, guys, okay? It's not like, hey, they have this in their theology, yada, yada, yada. It's only when an event happens, something blows up in their face, are they forced to come up with this conversation about the Ahruf. So before anyone starts debating later scholarly definitions, we need to remember what problem this doctrine was originally trying to solve. People heard different recitations. Some of them thought the other person was reciting it incorrectly. There were alarms were being triggered all over the place. And the explanation given was that the Quran had been revealed in seven aharuf. So this doctrine starts as a response to a conflict. Okay, that is important because from the very beginning, the aharuf is tied to a variation, not to later theory first, but to a practical problem of differing recitations in the community. So that becomes very, very important. Had that not been brought to anybody's attention, had never someone created a fuss about it, they would have been mum about this. We would have never known about it. So here's the first time, case study one, that the Aharuf, when it was first introduced into, uh, let's say, into Hadiths, was first introduced by Muhammad. All right. Here we come to one of the most important hadiths in the whole discussion. This is Bukhari 7550. Bukhari 7550 has two characters playing in here. We're going to take some time on this hadith. Okay. There are two Sahabas in here. One Sahaba named Umar bin Al Khattab is a senior Sahaba. He has been around for circa 13 to 14 years, a Muslim, before the second Sahaba, which is Hisham bin Hakim, who is a junior Sahaba, becomes a Muslim. So Umar bin Khattab becomes a Muslim in the sixth year of Muhammad's prophethood, and Hisham becomes a Muslim in year 630, 2 years before he dies. That is almost a 13-year gap between them. Okay? Now, what Bukhari 7550 says is that there's a mosque. I want you to think about this, play this movie out in your head. There's a mosque, and in that mosque, you have these two Sahabas present, and the junior Sahaba, Hisham bin Hakim, is narrating the Quran. Now, Bukhari 7550 says that Umar heard Hisham reciting Surah Al Furqan differently during the lifetime of Muhammad. This is happening during the lifetime of Muhammad. So he hears him reciting it differently. Now, what's very important to understand here too is that both of them were from the Qurayshi tribe and they had only one dialect. They shared only one dialect, the Qurayshi dialect. Keep this in mind, write this down, because this is going to be one of the number one things that Muslims try to come up and tell us is that this is a dialect issue. It is not. They all, both of them belong to the Quraysh tribe, and they had only one dialect. Got it? Okay. And and what happens is that he hears him recited differently. Okay. And Umar, the senior Sahaba, doesn't react mildly. He reacts as if something is seriously wrong. In fact, he has violent thoughts in his mind. He wants to beat this guy up. So he waits till he finishes the narration and then he confronts Hisham and accuses him of lying asking him where did he learn this narration from, the way he was narrating it. When the junior Sahaba says, I learned it from Muhammad, he says, you lie. This is important, guys. When we just talk casually about, oh, so and so is lying, so and so lying, it's not a big deal. But if you have a senior Sahaba accusing a junior Sahaba or another Sahaba of lying on the Quran, that could be a death sentence. So this hadith and the words in it matter. What's happening in it matters. What's going on. Practically everything in it is extremely eye opening. Okay, so he does not react mildly. He reacts as if something is seriously wrong, and then he confronts Hisham and accuses him and even seizes him. What does that mean? He actually takes out his waistcloth from his waist and starts choking him. Okay? And then he drags him to Muhammad. All these details matter because this is not a reaction of someone who is casually hearing a familiar authorized variation. This is not a reaction of someone who's hearing tomato versus tomato. You don't have such violent reactions on it. You don't accuse somebody else, literally, could be a death sentence of saying you're lying on the Quran. Umar actually treats it like an unacceptable recitation problem. He even frames it in terms of truth and falsehood by saying you're lying, essentially accusing Hisham of reciting the Quran in a way he was not taught. There's also a historical pressure point here, folks. Standard uh, biological chronology places Umar's conversion, as I said, in the sixth year of prophethood, while biographical notices commonly place Hisham's conversion much later around the conquest of Mecca. And we know the conquest of Mecca takes place in 630. If that chronology is right, then Omar had likely been a Muslim for well over a decade, close to 13 years before Hisham's conversion, and that makes Umar's shock even more significant because he's going, bro, I've not heard this in 13, 14 years. What did this come up with? That we have this different narration. It's also shocking because now they go to Muhammad. So he drags him by the neck, he pulls him and takes him to Muhammad, who, by the way, as a side note, humorous one, Muhammad's initial reaction is, you know what, unchoke the guy, you know, and he says, uh, Muhammad asks both the men to recite their versions. And then when he hears both of them, instead of correcting one and affirming the other, Muhammad approves both and introduces this explanation that the Quran was revealed in 7 Ahruf. The year is 630. 21 years after he started getting his revelation in 610. Muhammad starts getting his revelation in 610. 21 years later, suddenly Johnny come lately is talking about a haruf, and he's saying both versions are good because Allah revealed it to him in 7 harufs. Now, now here is where the pressure starts to build. If Umar had already been a Muslim for many years and Isham was a later convert, why does this explanation appear here only after the dispute breaks out? Why wasn't it on day one of class a part of a curriculum, not an afterthought, in your writing materials when Muhammad would come in and say, hello, my name is Muhammad, I'm your prophet, I'm going to teach you the Quran, and the Quran was revealed to me in 7 Ahruf. 21 years later, we suddenly have this because an event triggers it as a happenstance. Something just happens up there. It's not a part of the curriculum. Allah sent revelations and not a part of the curriculum. Okay, so now, as I said, if Umar had already been a Muslim for many years and Hisham was a later convert, why does this explanation appear here only after the dispute breaks out? Why are senior companions still being blindsided by recitation differences if this framework was already clearly taught and understood? So, this hadith is doing more than telling a story. It is showing us that the Ahruf explanation enters the record at the very moment a recitational conflict becomes too serious to ignore. Case study number two. Here we have a very famous Sahaba. His name is Ubay ibn Ka'b. Ubay ibn Ka'b is the Qari, the master of the Quran. He is among the four people that Muhammad said, if you want to learn the Quran, go learn it from these four, including Ibn Masud and Ubay bin Ka'b. And then he makes Ibn Masud and Ubay bin Ka'b to other narrations as the creme de la creme. In this account, Ubay bin Ka'b hears two people reciting the Quran differently from what he learned. He's, by the way, this guy was probably joined, became a Muslim in the very first year. So he's even senior to the last fellow. In this account, he hears the two people reciting the Quran differently from what he had learned, and that matter is brought before Muhammad. Both recitations are approved, and then Ubay describes what happened inside of him. He says, quote, Ubay narrates, there occurred in my mind a sort of denial and doubt that did not even exist in the time of Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah means pre Islam. So he says a kind of denial and doubt started creeping in his mind about Muhammad and Islam because he's going like, what? What? I've been here for all this time and this is your 2 years before in 630 you're bringing this thing up. I've been here for like maybe 17 years and we've never heard of it. So, and he says that uh, this particular denial doubt entered his mind, something he says had not even occurred to him in the days of ignorance before Islam. And that's a striking statement. Why? Because it shows that these recitation differences were not experienced as something trivial. They were destabilizing. They could shake confidence, even confidence in senior companions. And there is yet another pressure point here. Unlike Umar's report, this does not involve a brand new Muslim. Ubay, again, was an early and senior companion. So if he too is being blindsided by recitational differences this late in the story, that raises the same question again. If the seven Ahruf framework was already clearly taught and understood, why are major companions still reacting as if they're encountering something unexpected? This is something God sent you, Allah sent you, the entire Quran in seven Ahrufs, all the revelations, and we don't know about it? In other words, this is not just one isolated case with Umar. This pattern repeats itself. Then again, the explanation given is the same basic one. Again, the explanation to it is always the basic one. The Quran was revealed in multiple Ahruf. So now you have two early case studies doing the same basic job. They show that the doctrine of the Aruf is being introduced to explain conflicting recitations. But they also show that this explanation was not obvious enough to prevent any alarms, confusion, or even deep inner disturbance, like what happened with Ubay here among major companions. And that's a huge point, folks. If even Ubay was shaken by this after many years in Islam, then later Muslim claims that this issue, it's just a simple, it's easy, it was widely understood, starts to look too neat and too cute to sit down and be accepted. Right. So the next one, the what
Right,
these two.
Jay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so a couple of things on this one. So, the for my first point would be, like for seculars, it's obvious what's happening here, right? So what's happening is like when the Sahabas are fighting amongst each other and going to Muhammad and asking him which recitation is the correct one. Obviously, Muhammad is not going to tell them he thought one of them wrong. He has to come up with something of an excuse to save himself and say that they're both correct. Otherwise, they will start obviously denying him or like not following him. So that's his worst nightmare. Muhammad's fear always has been people will not follow him because in other narrations we see that. Anyway, so it's obvious what's happening here is Muhammad is coming up something uh, like on the spot and telling them because when you consider the time where this is up happening through the passage of time, Muhammad is forgetting the verses of the Quran. And there are actually hadiths that say that Muhammad did forget verses of the Quran and people used to remind him. So what's happening here is Muhammad would tell one verse of the Quran to one Sahaba in one way, and then he goes on and tell the same verse to another Sahaba in a different way, because he cannot repeat exactly word for word what he said. I mean, this is human nature, right? That's what happens when you try to recite something that, like, you thought you said last, maybe let's say last week. You wouldn't repeat it the same way. But Muhammad's claim was that he was receiving this from Allah, and if he was receiving it from Allah, then there wouldn't be any variation, because it's Allah who spoke it, not Muhammad. So Muhammad has to save himself and say that, oh, it's because the Quran was revealed in seven harufs. But do Muslims know what the seven harufs are? Absolutely not. That's literally the only explanation Muhammad gave them. He said seven harufs, and like Jay said, he will go into detail on that. But that's what's happening. Second point, I'll make it short, about Ubay ibn Ka'b, where Ubay felt a denial in his heart that he hasn't felt since the time of Jahiliyyah, basically from the time he was not a Muslim, the time of ignorance, basically. So you can see that it was not just a mere dialect difference, right? So if it was just something dialect, he wouldn't feel a denial in his heart, right? So the difference was obvious. Like, it's not just a dialect; it's more than that. More than that, do we have exactly what that shows what these differences were? In some places, yes, but for the most part, Muslims have tried their best to get rid of this by burning the Qurans and whatnot. So we will get into that as well. So I just wanted to mention these couple of points. You go ahead, Jay.
Sure. So, what these two hadiths have already established, if we put them side by side, we'll start noticing a pattern. In both cases, a senior companion hears a different recitation and assumes something is wrong. In both cases, the issue escalates and is brought before Muhammad. In both cases, recitations are accepted, and in both cases, the explanation given is the same, i.e., the Quran was revealed in seven aharuf. That repeated pattern tells us something important, that the doctrine of the aharuf is entering the tradition as a response to a recitational conflict. It is not presented in these hadiths as a framework that had already been calmly and clearly taught to everyone from the start. And that matters because both hadiths involve companions who had already been around Islam for decades. Yet they still react as if these recitational differences are surprising, that they are serious and destabilizing. So before we even get into scholarly latest definitions again, folks, we already have a major historical tension. If the seven aharuf were a well known, clearly understood category from early on, why do these hadiths present major companions as being blindsided? The next one. Moving along. So, what is a harf, anyways? So, now we move away from the hadith to the next obvious question: what exactly is a harf, singular, or a haruf? The hadith tells us that the Quran was revealed in seven aharuf, but the hadith themselves do not give us a clean technical definition of what that means. And that is where the confusion begins. Remember what we said. If we don't know what it is, we don't know where it is, then we don't know if it was preserved or not. For 1400 years, this has been a problem for them. They don't. But we'll continue on. So, because once later scholars try to explain the term, you start getting a wide range of interpretations. Some of them will connect it to dialect, others connect it to kinds of word variation, others treat it as a broader category of recitational flexibility. Just nonsense. So the doctrine itself is early, but the definition is not clear. And that matters a lot because if the foundational term, a haruf, is unclear, then every later claim about where the haruf are, how they survived, whether they were preserved, becomes harder and harder to prove cleanly. So before asking where the Ahruf went, we first have to admit the problem. The tradition tells us the category exists, but it does not hand us a neat definition of the category. The early answer was Ahruf just means dialects. Now, before I say that, there are 40 different opinions about this. There are 40 different opinions on what an Ahruf is. Anything that has 40 different opinions tells you that they are just throwing the kitchen sink at it, trying to come up with what does it mean. And that will become a problem. Again, we don't know what it is. Now, the easy answer they go for is Ahruf just means dialects. The most common answer people give is this: the seven ahruf means seven dialects, or at least seven dialectical modes. And to be fair, I understand with the Muslims why that answer is popular. They really don't know anything. They don't do deep dives into or ask questions or kind of push back and really want to learn about what these things are. They just hear something and they go like, oh, this is an easy answer, so just let me tell you it's dialects. Because it's simple, it's easy to explain, and it makes the hadith sound less threatening. Those two cases, those two hadiths, it makes them sound less threatening. It lets people say that the issue is basically one of linguistic accommodation. But the problem is that it does not cleanly solve all the data. Because the hadith reports we just looked at do not feel like people merely noticing harmless accent differences. Umar reacts aggressively. Ubay is shaken internally, and the Sahabas are belonging to the Quraysh tribe, and we learn from other places that they only share one dialect. So it can be about different dialects. These major companions act like they're encountering something serious, not a tomato or tomato issue, not something that has already been taught or taught to expect as a normal dialect variation. And that is why a purely dialectical explanation starts to feel too neat. It does not explain the whole issue cleanly. And if it did, later scholars would not keep struggling so much over what the Ahruf means. Out here, what we have are a couple of things that I just wanted to pick up. One is from Islam Q&A website, which is the number one website for Muslims where a lot of their scholars have these kind of questions asked and answered. And they clearly are saying that these two people are from the same tribe, and it says both of them in the second line on the top, both of them were from, in the green by the way, both of them were from Quraysh, and Quraysh had only one dialect. Below, and we've got a lot of pieces of evidence, I can't put everything out here, is again in another book where it says it may also be objected that Umar bin al-Khattab disagreed with the Hisham bin Hakim. Both are Qurayshi and their language and dialect were the same. So it can't be dialect. Quit it, Muslims, telling us it's dialect. Your scholarship, and we've got lots of them sitting down and saying it has nothing to do with dialect. A number of writers point out that Umar and Hisham are both described as Qurayshi from the same broader tribal linguistic setting. And that matters because if the difference were merely a matter of separate dialect, tribal dialects, this case would become much harder to explain. And there is yet another layer to the problem. At this early stage, Arabic writing was still largely consonantal and did not carry the full vocalization system that later readers are used to seeing in printed Qurans. So people should not imagine a fully mocked up text sitting in there with simple accent differences floating on top of it. A textual situation, the text, or rather the textual situation in this case, was more basic and less fixed than that. To say it's dialect, it does not do justice to the hadith, it does not do justice to the same tribe problem, and it does not do justice to the state of the early written text. Ardi, I don't know if you want to add something to this one here on the dialects.
Sure. Yeah. So obviously, the explanation that the differences between the recitation between the different Sahabas is just dialects is just one of the 40 opinions. It's one out of the 40 opinions. So when Muslims try to explain what the ahrufs are and what the variations are between the recitations, they some of them try to explain it as dialects, but there is no consensus on this. And usually what happens in Islam is whenever there is a difference of opinion between them, what they do is they try to go with the consensus. However, in this case there is no consensus. They don't agree on what, on a single explanation as to what the seven harufs are. And the other explanation, or the other point that I would like to point out here is, right now in front of me, for example, I have 9 different versions of the Quran. And within these 9 different versions of the Quran, there are differences in meanings between these Qurans. Okay, dialect difference wouldn't bring about a meaning difference, right? Like a British accent and an American accent, or my accent or somebody else's accent. I might say it differently, but it doesn't change the meaning of the word. However, what we see in the Quran today is actual differences in meaning. Okay, they are different in meanings. They have some have omissions, some have additions. So it's not just dialect. So whoever comes up to say that the harufs are just simply dialects, that's simply false. Yeah, that's what I want to say. Jay, go ahead.
Okay, so if it's not just dialects, then what is it? Once the dialect only answer starts to weaken, the next question becomes obvious. If Ahrufs are not dialect, what is it? And this is where the discussion also gets really messy, because later scholars do not give one neat answer. Some still connect the aharuf partly to dialectical variations, others connect it to different kinds of wording changes, others treat it as a broader form of recitational allowance or categories of variation. And the important point here is that not just that there are multiple views, the important point is that the existence of all these competing definitions show that the category was not stable or self explanatory. In other words, the tradition preserves the doctrine, but the meaning of the doctrine remains contested. And that is why the problem deepens as you go forward. Once scholars start trying to define a haruf in detail, the ambiguity does not go away. It actually becomes more visible. Okay, so here are the 40 different opinions. Okay, this is where the definition problem becomes almost impossible to ignore. Al Suyuti on the left reports that there are around 40 different opinions on what the seven aharuf meant. That alone should tell you that this was not a simple, transparent category. And the same basic point appears in later scholarly discussions as well on the right, which is a well known scholar, Islamic scholar, Shadi Nasir, in his book, The Transmission of the Variant Readings of the Quran, and states that there has never been a consensus on what the aharuf is. That reinforces the point made by the quotation on the right. The nature of the seven aharuf remain mysterious, it says, and no consensus was ever reached on what exactly they mean to signify. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if Allah sent this aharuf, according to Muhammad, or revealed his Quran in seven different aharufs, what are they, homie? What are they? If you can't tell me what they are, it starts becoming a devastating to the standard simplified story. Because if the central category itself never reached a clear consensus, then people cannot speak as though the issue is fully solved. And more importantly, if the category is unclear, then later claims about where the haruf are, how they survived, whether they're fully preserved, becomes much harder to establish in any precise way. So the problem is no longer just that they were different recitations. The problem is that the framework used to explain those recitations never became clear in a stable, universally agreed way. Now, the Ahar